He had built his entire identity on the belief that he could bend the world to his will. From the moment he took power, Adolf Hitler convinced himself and everyone around him that history would obey him, that nations would collapse in front of him, and that the East would deliver the victory he needed to rule Europe forever. For years, every gamble he made seemed to work. Austria fell without a shot. Czechoslovakia was handed over on paper. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. By 1941, Hitler believed he was unstoppable. He believed he was chosen. He believed the Soviet Union would crumble just as easily as every other enemy he had crushed. And then winter arrived, and the Eastern Front revealed a truth that even Hitler, for all his delusion, could not ignore. The moment he realized the war in the East could not be won did not happen in a single instant. It wasn't a dramatic proclamation or a sudden breakdown. It came in layers, a series of moments, a slow collapse of illusions, a sequence of reports, defeats, disasters and frustrations that forced him, quietly and reluctantly, to confront the reality he spent years denying. But historians agree there was a definitive point in time where Hitler privately understood that the Eastern Front was lost, even if he refused to admit it publicly. And that moment came in late 1941, during the desperate winter around Moscow, when his armies, once unstoppable, were frozen, starving, exhausted, and no longer advancing. In his bunker headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the reports came in every hour. The temperature outside had plunged to -20, then -30, then -40. Weapons jammed, engines froze solid. Thousands of soldiers were falling not from bullets, but from frostbite. Entire divisions were wrapped in rags, curtains, tablecloths, anything they could rip from abandoned Soviet houses because the German command hadn't prepared them with proper winter clothing. Hitler had expected the campaign to end before the cold set in. He genuinely believed that the Soviet Union would collapse like a rotten door long before winter touched his troops. But now winter was here, and the rotten door hadn't collapsed. It had slammed shut. Hitler still delivered speeches saying the final victory was near. He still barked at his generals to push forward. But behind closed doors, the truth felt different. On December 5th, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counter-offensive outside Moscow. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were forced into a full-scale retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, not a repositioning, a retreat, the word Hitler hated most. And when his generals told him the front was collapsing, he refused to believe it. He exploded with rage. He accused them of cowardice. He accused them of losing their nerve. He said the Red Army was in its final breath. But even as he denied reality, the truth was printed clearly in every report that crossed his desk. His dream of a lightning victory in the East was dead. The first crack in Hitler's confidence appeared that same night. He ordered every general within reach to the Wolf's Lair. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch arrived expecting to brief Hitler on the crisis. Instead, Hitler attacked him verbally, screaming that the failures at the front were not the army's fault, but von Brauchitsch's fault specifically. Hitler claimed the troops were not fighting hard enough. He said retreat was treason. He said every inch of ground must be held, even at the cost of annihilation. But then, in a rare moment of honesty, von Brauchitsch told Hitler something that struck at the core of his delusion. The troops can no longer carry out your orders. They are at the end of their strength. For a long moment, Hitler did not respond. This was not what he expected to hear. This was not how the war was supposed to go. And for the first time, he understood. The Eastern Front was slipping out of his control. He fired von Brauchitsch days later and took personal command of the army, something no leader of a modern nation had attempted. He believed only he could turn the situation around. But the reports continued to worsen. Entire units were collapsing. The Soviets were advancing. German soldiers were digging trenches with their bare hands because their shovels had snapped in the frozen earth. Horses were freezing to death standing up. Tanks were becoming metal coffins. Generals begged for permission to withdraw to new defensive lines. Hitler refused every request. His orders became a mantra: stand fast. Not one step back to retreat was to admit defeat. To admit defeat was unthinkable. So instead, he forced his armies to hold impossible positions. Thousands died for villages that no longer had strategic value. Commanders wrote that they had never seen suffering on this scale. Soldiers wrote home saying they no longer feared the enemy, only the cold. And Hitler kept insisting victory was near, but the moment that shattered his denial completely came in late December of 1941, when he received two messages that forced him to confront reality. The first was military. His intelligence officers reported that the Soviet Union had far more reserves than he ever believed possible. Instead of the Soviet state collapsing, it was mobilizing millions. New divisions were arriving from Siberia, fully trained, well-equipped, and prepared for winter warfare. They pushed the Germans back miles from Moscow. The Red Army was not collapsing, it was growing stronger. The second message was political, and it hit him even harder. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler expected Japan to join the war against the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan focused entirely on the United States and ignored his pleas to attack Siberia. So now, in one stroke, Hitler had achieved the worst possible outcome. The United States had entered the war, and Japan was still not helping him in the East. That evening, witnesses say Hitler sat alone in his study for hours, staring silently at a map of the Soviet Union. He barely spoke. For a man who always projected certainty, confidence, and rage, this silence felt like a confession. The war he thought he would win before Christmas was now stretching into a long nightmare with no end in sight. It was in those weeks that Hitler privately admitted something he never said publicly. The war in the East could no longer be won in the way he envisioned. His idea of a quick, decisive victory, what he called a lightning blow, was impossible. The Soviet Union was too vast. The Red Army was too resilient. The winter was too brutal. His armies were too exhausted. But even worse, he knew the industrial capacity of Germany could not match the combined power of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire, not in a long war. This was the realization he feared most, not because he cared about Germany, but because his entire ideology depended on conquest. He had promised the German people victory. He had promised the generals victory. He had promised himself victory. And now, in the privacy of his bunker, he finally understood that the foundation of his vision had collapsed. But instead of adapting, instead of negotiating, instead of retreating strategically or shortening his lines, Hitler made the worst strategic decision of the war. He doubled down. If the war couldn't be won quickly, he would force it to be won through sheer willpower. If the Soviets wouldn't collapse, he would force his soldiers to fight until they froze or bled out. If his generals questioned him, he replaced them with men who didn't. If his allies disappointed him, he ignored them. He replaced rational strategy with blind force, and from that decision came every disaster of the later war: Stalingrad, Kursk, the retreat through Ukraine, the collapse of Army Group Center, the final destruction of the Eastern Front. But the seed of all those tragedies began in that winter of 1941, when Hitler realized the truth and refused to accept it. Some generals later described the transformation they saw in him. Before the winter of 1941, Hitler was confident, energetic, charismatic, and obsessed with details. After the winter, he became paranoid, unstable, and obsessed with fantasy. He stopped trusting his generals. He stopped listening to reports. He started relying on ideology instead of strategy. One general said, "After that winter, we no longer had a leader. We had a man living in a separate reality." The Eastern Front became the graveyard of the German army. Millions of soldiers died fighting a war that Hitler knew was unwinnable. And the tragedy is that he kept that truth to himself. He never admitted it to the German people. He never admitted it to the army. He never admitted it even to his closest advisors. He simply forced them all to continue marching toward the abyss. By the end of the war, the Eastern Front stretched over 1,000 miles of destruction, starvation, burning cities, and shattered armies. It became the largest and bloodiest theatre of war in human history, and it began with one man's belief that he could reshape an entire continent through force alone. The day Hitler realized the Eastern Front was unwinnable was not marked on any calendar. There was no speech, no announcement, no diary entry, but historians, generals, and witnesses all point to the same period, those bitter days of December 1941, when the truth became undeniable, even to him. He understood that the dream of conquering the East was over. He understood that the war had turned against him. He understood that the Soviet Union could not be defeated by the strategy he built his empire on. He knew, but he refused to act on it. And so the war dragged on for years. Millions more died. Entire nations were destroyed. Cities were turned into ruins, all because the man who started the war could not accept that he had already lost it. In the end, Hitler's downfall came not from a single battle, not from a single enemy, but from a single moment of realization, followed by a refusal to face it. That moment in late 1941 marked the turning point not just of the Eastern Front, but of the entire Second World War, and the world would pay the price for the years he spent denying the truth.